Lori Kirkstead, and this is The Imposter's Guide to Authentic Leadership, a podcast for new leaders who are ready to stop depending on external approval and start trusting themselves. This series is based on my book of the same name, so if anything you hear speaks to you and you want to go deeper, that's where to go next for more context and to do the leadership activity prompts. So this podcast is for people who got promoted because they were great at their jobs and then realized that leadership felt less like an accomplishment and more like starting over. Okay, so in the last episode, we started talking about purpose and specifically how people pleasers tend to confuse being needed with having purpose, since all of your positive reinforcement has been kind of pointing in the same direction for years. Today, we're going to move on to the second dimension, and that's values. And I want to start with something that might sting a little. Most people pleasers actually know what they value. And I include myself in this. We can name our values without thinking about it really too hard. And the problem isn't knowing. The problem is the moment things get uncomfortable, those values bend faster than anyone can expect. And the disorienting part is it rarely feels like compromise when it's happening. It feels like flexibility or thoughtfulness or picking your battles wisely. And in corporate America, being seen as being flexible or thoughtful or wisely choosing your battles is a positive thing. Dr. Bill George talks about values as the internal standards you return to when everything gets complicated. Like when you're deciding not just what to do, but who you want to be while you're doing it. They act like the guardrails that you build for yourself, so your decisions come from something that's, grounded in something real instead of whatever feels the loudest or the most urgent in the moment. What I love about how he frames this is he says values only mean something in the moments when honoring them costs you something. Say that again. Values only mean something in the moments when honoring them costs you something. Anyone can say they believe in honesty or fairness, but those words really don't hold weight until you are the person choosing whether to tell the truth or whether to stay quiet because that would be easier, or whether to stand beside your team when the pressure is building from above or to kind of let them take the blame. Over time, people stop listening to the words you use and they start watching the patterns you actually live by. And the patterns are where the trust forms. Not the things you say you believe, it's the things you do and show your team. For people pleasers, the trap is that we're trained long before we ever held a leadership title to treat, let's call it harmony, as the highest value there is. Harmony is very good at pretending to be integrity because, you tell yourself you're being thoughtful and you're picking your battles and you'll address it when the timing is better. But over time, that pattern stops being occasional and it becomes your default. You back down whenever standing firm would make someone else in the room uncomfortable, let's say. And you start, routing around the hard conversations before they even fully form because the discomfort feels disproportionate, even though you've never actually tested what would happen if you stayed in it. I spent a very long time believing I was living my values because I could name them and because I cared about them. What I didn't see was how often I was just folding the moment a situation got complicated. Not in the ways that anyone would have specifically called out, but I notice in my daily compromises. And like I said, they reveal a pattern. And once you slow down enough to look at it, it's sort of an oh my gosh moment. There was someone on my team who wasn't meeting expectations, and I knew it, everyone around me knew it. And I was a young manager, so I kept circling it instead of addressing it directly. I'd ask leading questions, I'd drop hints, I'd keep hoping they'd arrive at the conclusion themselves so they wouldn't have to be the one to say it. But saying it directly meant being the reason someone felt bad. And that cost felt, if I'm being totally honest, enormous to me. It's my job to give feedback, but yet I didn't want to make anyone feel bad. When I finally had the conversation I should have had weeks earlier, they looked at me and just said, "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" And they were right. I had wasted their time and mine trying to protect a feeling that was never mine to protect in the first place. Now, what values actually do, the job they're supposed to do, is force purpose out of your head and into your mouth. Purpose can stay comfortable forever if you let it. It can live in a nice paragraph you say out loud at the conference and never get tested once in your entire career. Values are what make purpose inconvenient, because values are the things standing between knowing what you see and saying what you see. And that is a much harder threshold to cross than people give it credit for. I really used to think the hard part of leadership was figuring out what mattered to me. It wasn't. I already knew. The hard part really was letting what mattered to me actually show up in a hard conversation instead of, I guess, staying safely in a space of believing something about myself. I thought something about myself, but I really wasn't showing it through my values. And I want to be the first to tell you that there is a significant cost to leaving that distance unaddressed. Even though it's easy to really miss because nobody can see this happening on the outside. It's all on the inside. It's like the person who needed the feedback never gets it, so they just keep doing the thing. And meanwhile, the rest of the team is watching you and they're not saying anything because they're wondering what else you might be holding back from them too. Like the trust you worked so hard to build starts cracking, and it's really not because you lied to anyone overtly, but more so because you weren't honest enough when it actually mattered. There's nuance to all this. Withholding information someone needs to grow is not staying neutral. It's not a neutral, harmless choice. Every week I put off that conversation was a week that person, I guess, spent stumbling around without the full picture. And that's my fault. They were doing the best with half of the story, while I held on to what I knew and told myself was, what I thought was being kind. There was always a tell when that distance sort of crept back in. Like I'd walk out of a conversation that looked completely fine on the surface with everyone smiling, including me, but I'd still carry think of it like a low-grade fever, like a low-grade tension that didn't really match how the meeting had gone. I don't think the feeling was anxiety, but it was like the space between what my purpose had already shown me and then my values still hadn't made me say out loud. It was all talk and no action. It did get stronger though, and every time I closed that space and I closed that gap, even with my voice shaking a little bit, I had to learn the relationship wasn't going to fall apart. And it didn't. Hard conversations don't really destroy solid relationships, or they shouldn't. They were just asking me to finally act on what I had already known to be true. Okay, so before the next episode, I want you to think about something. Think about a moment recently where you softened feedback until it barely resembled what you actually needed it to say. Or maybe a situation where you put off a conversation you knew you needed to have happen, but you just didn't. And ask yourself, what were you protecting? The answer is almost always more about your own discomfort than about the other person's well-being. And once you see it clearly, it gets a hell of a lot harder to keep calling that kindness. All right, so in the next episode, we're going to talk about the third dimension, and that's heart. Specifically, why people pleasers are almost always convinced they've already mastered it. And before we go, I just want to remind you that this podcast is a peek at the book, which has the full framework by Dr. Bill George and the exercises that go with it. You can find more info on where to buy it in the show notes, and if you know a new leader who needs to hear this, please send it their way because it really does help get the word out. All right, that is it for episode 7. I am so glad you're here. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next one.